Hello, this is Mike Diercksen from Proactive, and you are listening to the Building Bite podcast. Tune in as we spotlight Patrick McBride, Head of Construction Property, and David Edsey, Climate Director and Vice President with Zurich Insurance. Today's episode is on sustainability, and 3 ways sustainability is building momentum in the construction industry. For more information on the episode and others, please check out the Building Bite at www.buildwithproactive.com.
Welcome to the Building Bite podcast, a podcast for construction contractors, owners, and insurance professionals, where you can hear from the experts about key topics driving your business today. I'm Chris Epps, a Senior Director with Proactive, and I'm joined here by my co-host Mike Diercksen, Senior Consultant of Innovation and Content Solutions at Proactive, and our guest today, Patrick McBride, Head of Construction Property at Zurich, and David Edsey, Climate Director and VP also at Zurich. Patrick and David, how are you gentlemen this afternoon?
Doing well, Chris. Thanks for having us.
Real good, Chris. Thank you.
Fantastic. We're excited to dig in with you guys today. Mike, how about yourself? How are you doing today?
Doing great, Chris. Really excited to have David and Patrick on, two subject matter experts for us, and always great to have a collaborative approach with that.
Yep, we got 2 really talented individuals with a lot of ground to cover, so we'll dive in. Our topic today is sustainability, and 3 ways sustainability is building momentum in the construction industry. Patrick and David, we are absolutely thrilled to get the chance to talk to you guys, and I think this will be really informative for our listeners, so we can't wait to hear your insights. Before we get to our main topic, though, I'd like to ask each of you a little bit about your background, and if you could explain to us kind of the path to where you are now. And Patrick, I'll start with you.
Sure. Well, Chris, thank you. First of all, just really excited to be here, obviously, with David and myself. Sustainability is certainly an important part of what we do and what we're trying to do in the future at our current roles and our positions. So really excited to expand and from my perspective, share what I'm seeing and hear from the literal expert in David in what he does every day. So really a bit on me, and I'll go way back, actually. So I attended Texas A&M University for college and had a finance undergrad. And coming out of school, like many, I was not looking to get into the insurance industry by any means. Didn't know much about insurance for that matter. However, was looking for analyst type roles in the commercial banking space, and actually ran across this underwriting role. And actually it was a trainee position within Zurich Insurance Group, and read about it, and it sounded fairly similar to the scope of what I was looking to do early in my career, and had that foundation of a college hire program, and applied and was lucky enough to get hired in and spend many months in Schaumburg, Illinois at home office, really building a foundational understanding of property casualty insurance. And so from there, I was lucky enough to earn a position on Zurich's construction team, where I was placed in the Dallas office and spent a number of years in elevated responsibility roles, focusing on first-party cover for large contractors and large owners. Specific technical focus was in master builder's risk and project builder's risk placements, as well as contractor property and other first-party covers in the contracting space, supporting inland marine lines, and a number of emerging other topics over the years. From there, I had an opportunity to switch gears a little bit in my career, spent about 6 to 7 years in an underwriting chair, and then went over to the brokerage community, where I joined Willis Towers Watson as a middle market broking leader. So served clients in the general industry space. Construction was a focus, but we also had manufacturing, real estate, hospitality, tech, government contracting, etc., and had an opportunity to focus for those client placement programs, as well as run a team of middle market brokers. I did that in Texas as well as in the Mid-Atlantic territory, before having the opportunity to rejoin Zurich a number of years later as the regional construction property leader, focused on those similar lines that I was an underwriter of for Zurich's South region. So did that for about 3 years. And in the past 7 months, I've assumed the head of construction property role for Zurich, responsible for our builder's risk portfolio, our first party contractor solution, as well as a number of emerging products that have launched recently. So very excited to be here.
Okay, awesome, and we're excited to talk about some of those products, I think, a little bit further down the line here. But shifting gears a little bit, David, how about yourself? Can you share a little bit about your background and how you ended up kind of transitioning from legal into insurance coverage and then climate director, which is a bit of a unique path?
Yeah, no, that's right, Chris. I started out my professional career in the law after graduating from law in the Chicago area for a good a dozen years or so before I moved in-house to Zurich's claims legal department, where I supported the property claims group, basically giving them coverage advice and also managing coverage and bad faith litigation. From there, about 4 years ago, I moved into the technical underwriting department at Zurich. So I was a manager in charge of a small group of property product designers. So we refreshed our existing products and created new products. And then about a year ago, Zurich posted for this new position of climate director within technical underwriting to really look at the products and services that we offer our customers, to really look for opportunities to help our customers with the transition to net zero, and also in facing increased risks due to climate change. So I've always been interested in climate change. It's always something that has kept me up at night. And so it was, when I saw that position, I thought it would be a great opportunity to really merge my underwriting background with my interest in climate change. And surprisingly, they hired me. So that's what I've been doing for the last year.
Yeah, no, David, I was going to say, it is a unique progression, right? Going from the legal counsel more towards the insurance side of the underwriting, and obviously now ending in the climate director. Was there something about underwriting? Like, how did that change start to happen? What drew you to that side of the business?
Yeah, interestingly, Michael, it was cyber. When I was in claims legal, I was managing our response to some non-petya cyber losses that some of our accounts had been exposed to. And then I began being drawn into underwriting to really look at our entire property portfolio's cyber exposure within our property products. And I was then really pulled into technical underwriting to help out with our cyber exposures in our property book.
Fascinating. Yeah, it's amazing how interconnected it can all be at times, and one thing kind of overlaps into the next. The next thing you know, you're on a completely different career path, David. So thank you for sharing that. And I'm excited to jump right in, because I think there's a lot to cover here. And I know we had talked in the past, sustainability initiatives are rapidly gaining momentum in the industry. We're hearing about that from corporate responsibility. It's in the news, it's trending in all the right directions, hopefully. And with that, there's new opportunities, right? New goals and initiatives that we're trying to drive towards. So, Patrick, I wonder if you could maybe position this from your standpoint. What do you think is driving that change and elevating that sustainability as a focal point within the industry?
Yeah, really great question, Michael, and something from my perspective, obviously on the construction insurance side, really moving more from a casual observer to more of an active participant in this space, and really trying to keep a pulse, because it's evolving very quickly. And to your question specifically, I think, the increasingly frequent and severe weather patterns that we're seeing, the general changes, as well as, just being the right thing to do, I think is the main cultural driver behind the behaviors in terms of a lot of organizations' intent and desire to become a more sustainable, more environmentally friendly organization. And really, I think from a builders and owners perspective, when we talk about means, methods, and materials, it's really less of a nice to have anymore. And really, it's becoming more of a bottom line issue in a number of areas. So, a few of the things that we're seeing in the space that are evolving over time, I'd like to speak to a couple. One, we're actually seeing some contractual requirements change over time from an owner perspective and whom they're contracting with. We're seeing some large owners actually bake into contracts in whom they're contracting with sustainability requirements, making sure that those contractors that are building on behalf of these owners have ESG commitments or aspects of sustainability baked into their process, and that they're contributing to carbon reducing and sustainability measures, which is interesting. That's something that we haven't seen in the past. So we find that unique and interesting. We're also seeing in certain areas of the country progress being made in adding new or substitute material into the type of material that goes into a facility. It's generally been driven by municipality requirements that we've seen so far. As an example, take concrete. It's said to be responsible for roughly 8% of all global greenhouse gas emissions. And what we're seeing is some municipalities have actually passed mandates to substitute portions of what normally would go into the cement to make it a more carbon-friendly product. The specific substitute we've heard is fly ash and slag, which actually improves the carbon emittance that goes into the manufacturing of the cement. So that's just one, example that we, as previously a casual observer, are becoming becoming more of an interested party in terms of how that impacts, contracting, how it impacts the material that we're, of course, trying to underwrite. So very interesting things.
Yeah, and Patrick, we're certainly hearing a lot about new resource options from a materials perspective, especially coming out of COVID and supply chain disruption issues and all the problems that creates. But, teeing up some of those alternatives certainly feels like there's increased buy-in from owners and industry as a whole on trying to identify and spec out those options in a cost-effective alternative manner. You guys kind of seeing that the same way?
Yeah, I completely. We are, whether it's from an owner standpoint or a builder standpoint, the push for the environmental, social, and governance platform, those ESG platforms, obviously are, developed and starting to be executed in a number of spaces. So, from an industry perspective, we also recently saw that the American Institute of Architects, the AIA, kind of the governing body from a lot of the contracts in the construction space, they actually made a low carbon emission products initiative where they're really pushing for preferential products that are known to be less carbon intensive. So that's an interesting kind of evolution. On the owner side, we're also seeing varying levels of support, whether it's applying carbon tax or things like cap and trade, or even self-induced carbon pricing. We've seen a number of large owners, particularly in the tech space, really be key drivers of that, self-induced corporate carbon pricing mechanism, which is interesting. And then just hot off the press, just this last week, we saw that the Department of Energy actually announced that all federal buildings will be constructed by the federal government in compliance with some more stringent energy requirements per the 2021 International Energy Conservation Code. So the reason we think that's impactful, and this is something that I actually didn't quite realize, you always kind of assumed, but the federal government is actually the largest, if not one of the largest, asset owners and managers in terms of facilities under assets in the country. They have multiple $1 billion of square foot. So the fact that they're instituting some sustainable mechanisms into new construction as well as major renovations, I think that'll be a very interesting evolution across the country. And then kind of in the build-to-suite space, we're seeing occupants increasingly interested in having more sustainable facilities. Take Zurich, for example. Zurich's also a large asset owner in and of itself with the offices. Zurich built a new headquarter back in 2016, and it was built to LEED Platinum certification under the U.S. Green Building Council. So, I think we're seeing a lot of that, whether it's new construction or build out, a lot of owners desiring to build with more sustainable means and methods. So, kind of to summarize it, we're seeing, more mandates that affect the ability to win business in the contracting space when it comes to sustainability. We're also seeing, new and unique emerging means and methods in order to meet some of those sustainability requirements that are being expected. And then more organizations are just, doing the right thing and elevating sustainability, including buildings that they use or occupy. So it's creating a lot of momentum in the sustainability space that we're certainly, as a large construction insurer, very interested in not just supporting, but continuing to understand ourselves.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it certainly feels like more mandates are coming as more organizations become more responsible and kind of get on board with that platform. And with ever-increasing environmentally friendly methods and materials emerging as more viable solutions, it seems like some of these organizations are really starting to elevate sustainability in their ESG programs really into the hierarchy of their decision making. And I guess, David, I'd like to ask you, from where you sit as climate director, one, do you kind of see it the same way? And what do you think the macro forces driving those, maybe separate from the other side of the industry? What do you see driving those demands in construction?
Yeah, I think the macroeconomic forces at play, the pressures really on all U.S. companies, including the construction industry, to address climate change, come from a number of places. I think at the very base, it's, climate change science. As Patrick mentioned, a lot of companies are just feeling the pressure to do the right thing because of the science of climate change, which basically says we have to reach net zero carbon emissions by 2050 if we're going to avoid, the bleakest aspects of what climate change could lead to. We've already warmed, the atmosphere has already warmed 1.1 degrees Celsius on average above pre-industrial times due to all the greenhouse gases that we've emitted. So, what climate scientists are telling us, if we want to have a good chance of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees, As a planet, we need to ramp down greenhouse gas emissions by about 50% by 2030 and to reach net zero by 2050. So it's not just countries or governments that need to manage this, because not all governments are, but the responsibility also falls on, companies, communities, and even individuals to lower their greenhouse gas emissions. But I think the second big pressure that companies are seeing is just, changing customer preferences in favor of green companies. I think as more people become aware of the urgency of the need to reduce emissions, and this is especially true, I think, of younger generations that have to, that they're going to have to live in this potentially much more volatile world, they are going to choose to do business with companies that are positive forces in the battle against climate change, and not do business with companies that are going to be negative forces. Another pressure is just the reputational risk to companies for failing to act. So the laggards in climate change transition, they face the risk of their reputation being tarnished as climate activism and as their competitors' progress in this space advances. I think next, corporate customer demand trickles down the supply chain. So what I'm talking about here is public companies are increasingly measuring their emissions, setting targets, and reporting on their emissions. And this includes their scope 3 or their supply chain emissions. As they do this, they are going to be putting pressure on their suppliers to also manage their emissions. So even if you're not a public company, if you're doing business with one, if they're your customer, they're going to start putting pressure on you. Zurich is an example. I mean, we are a public company. We have set net zero targets, but we've also now instituted a sustainable sourcing initiative. So we are looking at our main suppliers and asking them to also set net zero targets and lower their emissions like we're doing in our operations. Another trend you're seeing is investor demand. I mean, there's trillions of dollars under investment management that have committed to net zero. And this also includes the emergence of ESG mutual funds and ETFs. Mm-hmm. So there's, many very large money managers and pension fund managers like BlackRock, we've heard on, is a good example. And even Zurich Insurance, Patrick and my employer, we have joined the UN-sponsored Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance, which has committed to reducing our investment portfolio to net zero by 2050. And the last pressure I'll mention upon companies in the U.S. is really anticipated regulatory requirements. So right now in the U.S., there is no price on carbon, but there might be in the future. Building codes in general don't address carbon emissions, but they could in the future. The Securities and Exchange Commission, though, just last week issued a new proposed rule requiring public companies to disclose their greenhouse gas emissions. So that rule may be final by the end of this year. So anyway, rather than wait for laws to change, I think many forward-looking companies are getting ahead of the game and addressing their emissions now rather than to be, caught flat-footed in the future. So those are some of the general climate change transition risk pressures upon all U.S. companies today. And those pressures, they're likely to increase as time goes on.
Yeah, David, it's interesting because, you mentioned that. I think Patrick mentioned earlier that the new headquarters out in Schaumburg was built, as platinum certified. And I wonder, as these different stakeholders in the marketplace start to look at this and evaluate these things, it's not even necessarily external, right? It could be internal. They start to look at their own footprint and their own impact there. So, I mean, is that something you think is a prime target to make those reductions?
Well, definitely. I mean, if you think about, let me just throw out a statistic. Buildings are responsible for close to 40% of worldwide greenhouse gas emissions. And that's per the International Energy Agency. So when a business commits to reducing their greenhouse gas emissions, their buildings are generally going to be the first thing that they're going to concentrate on. And it's probably a good point just to distinguish between operational emissions in a building and the embodied carbon emissions of a building. So what are those things? The operational carbon emissions are the emissions generated in operating a building. The electricity usage, the heating systems, the cooking systems. The embodied carbon emissions are not something you hear about a lot, but they're starting to really be addressed by the construction industry and by building professionals. And what those are the emissions that are caused by constructing the building, the construction process, but more importantly, by the materials that go into that building. So cement and steel are two of the biggest ones. But generally, those embodied carbon emissions comprise about between 11 and 23% of total global emissions. So it's a pretty big number. And if you consider that the built environment is expected to double by the middle of this century, and that's largely due to the population growth that's expected by then, it's really imperative that these embodied carbon emissions be addressed if we're going to keep global warming in check. And again, many companies, Zurich included, are voluntarily making commitments to reduce the operational and embodied carbon emissions as part of their overall net zero commitments. And I think market research bears that out. I mean, the global green building market is expected to grow at about a 14.3% compound annual growth rate through 2027. So as I think Patrick can tell you, I mean, we are noticing in the marketplace an increased demand for green buildings.
Yeah, that's a great point, David. And Patrick, I'm looking at you right now because we're talking about contractual demands, the ESG commitments. They're working hand in hand, and we're seeing that momentum build. But from a practical standpoint, I mean, it's great to want to do this and to think about doing this, but there is a practicality to this, right? Having the means and methods, getting the materials. Maybe they're not affordable, maybe they're not accessible to certain people. Have you seen changes in this? Have you seen that maybe something driving towards that on your end of the business?
Yeah, absolutely. And Michael, you're spot on. Often it's the chicken or the egg, right? You have a lot of these initiatives, but then it's the question of, okay, how do we deliver on those initiatives? And David spoke to it, focusing on those embodied carbons associated with construction. Actually, from a new building standpoint, about 50% of emissions come from those embodied carbons. So, that's a key source. And about of that, 70% comes from really six materials. And David already alluded to the top two are steel and concrete. Steel's at roughly 32%, concrete's around 22%. So the question is, outside of the material substitutes, what other means and methods are there? And one of the trends that we're seeing and fully believe to expect it to continue to grow and something in my research before I came on this podcast, I took a look at a couple of the other podcasts, and I think a couple other of the experts that you had on were absolutely spot on when they spoke about the excitement and the energy around a newer construction and emerging construction type called mass timber construction. So I think there's been some really good information around there about what mass timber construction is, but just for your viewers to level set from a very high level perspective, what mass timber is, it's a class of engineered wood product that essentially the material, the wood, is prefabricated from layers of wood that's been pressed together in different degrees, angles, widths, and sizes. And essentially what is unique and really new about that is the prefabricated and engineering aspect of it allows structures to be built much taller than traditional light wood frame construction. So it's important kind of to keep light wood frame construction, as I refer to it, think 2x2s, 2x4s, 2x6s, which is vastly different from a pre-engineered wood product that can be, multiple plies thick from a constructability and strength standpoint. So, we're really excited about mass timber. We think it is one of the low-hanging fruits, if you will, in terms of the availability for contractors to meet some of those means and method requests to meet some of those sustainability initiatives. And really, we originally saw mass timber begin in the Pacific Northwest and along the West Coast, but have really seen it trend across the country. We're looking at large projects in the South, in the Midwest, and the East. So we expect that trend to continue. And kind of why is it so interesting? Well, first and foremost, if you think about the material, it's wood. And so the question of sustainability is met in the fact that wood is by definition a renewable resource. It can be regrown and replenished, over time. So, that's an interesting aspect. And then the carbon sequestering aspect that trees and wood have, wood actually sequesters carbon and holds it through its lifetime. So that's another interesting aspect if you think about the life cycle of carbon emissions when it goes from raw source through finished product. And the manufacturing piece, if you compare what the manufacturing carbon emission that goes into a mass timber product or facility compared to a traditional method, it actually takes less carbon to produce a mass timber element versus a traditional element, which is also unique. And then just the weight of wood compared to traditional elements is considered lighter. So therefore, you need less work, less utility, less prep on the site from a footprint standpoint, which also aids in the amount of effort and carbon emissions that go with facilities that are constructed of mass timber. And then, really the other big desire is the aesthetic quality that mass timber can bring. It's said to bring a warming tone and a more inviting environment for those individuals that occupy either living or working in those types of facilities. And then the actual construction of it, if you think about it, it's a pre-manufactured product. So it's designed and manufactured somewhere else other than the project site. And then it's shipped to site and simply erected. So oftentimes we've seen reports and in practice, the construction times are shortened because of the pre-manufactured nature of it, which reduces the amount of labor you need on site, potentially the cost. There could be some safety elements and improvements in there as well. So really interesting, around the development. But to answer your question, Michael, we're seeing, mass timber as being a new and emerging trend that certainly is heating up in the construction marketplace.
Patrick, I can't tell you the last conference I went to that didn't have at least one or two sessions on mass timber. So people are certainly getting excited about it. It's definitely a hot topic of discussion. And even just hearing you talk, I picked up a couple of tidbits I haven't heard before. So you learn something every day. That said, it seems like there's still a little bit of hesitancy in the market from just a wide-scale implementation standpoint. What do you think may be driving that, or is there's some insights you could give us there?
Yeah, and from the context of the insurance perspective and the risk perspective, it's fair to say and factual that there is, and really there's really two key points. First, with any emerging risk, or any emerging technique, material, topic, etc., the insurance industry based a lot of its predictive expectations based on historical information available. And unfortunately, there is not a lot of historical information available out there because it is a new topic. So,
right.
By definition, there is a little more of a conservative approach when it comes to mass timber in general. And then the other piece is, and this is really the important piece, is that wood construction, traditional light wood frame, has had difficult experience in the marketplace for a number of years, requiring insurance carriers to modify terms, conditions, and loss funding expected given the frequency of severe losses in that space. And so, there are different qualities of mass timber. And after Zurich doing its own resource, being very engineering heavy and lead, Zurich made the decision that, to recognize the differences between a pre-engineered mass timber product and a light wood frame built facility, recognizing that is coming from a difficult experienced area of the marketplace. So Zurich has actually launched a very strategic position with considerable capacity in the space and a detailed product to address the exposures and opportunities with mass timber. So we're very excited about it, but at the same time recognize, and our hope is that with the continued successful loss-free experienced growth in the marketplace, as well as delivery of product, that obviously more information will become available to make more fact-based decisions on the product.
Yeah, and I wonder, David, transitioning over to you on this side, because like Chris mentioned, we've heard a lot about this at conferences, but maybe people aren't as familiar with mass timber. They haven't quite dug in on the research side. I mean, that's something that we've been considering as a whole building design when it comes to sustainability. And I'm wondering if you could maybe elaborate a little bit on that, and what are the beneficiaries of that in doing it that way?
Sure, Michael. Yeah, and so I guess you're talking about different approaches really to addressing the embodied carbon of a new building. So you could do it basically with specification of materials, just taking the existing design and substituting less carbon intensive materials. But the other way to do it, it's probably the best way to do it, is this whole building design that you mentioned, or it's also sometimes referred to as whole building life cycle assessment. It's really looking at the building from the construction to through the operational stage and really even to the end of life, the demolition of the building, and tallying up what is going to be the total carbon footprint of that building. And so looking at mass timber would certainly fall into that kind of whole building category of design, because it really looks at the entire building. As Patrick mentioned, it's lighter, so you need less of a footprint of a base which is going to be cement largely, which is very carbon intensive. So with a mass timber building, you can minimize the carbon content of that foundation. Whole building design also looks at things like, is it better to renovate or adapt an existing building rather than to knock it down and build a new building? What is going to be, the overall carbon emission from those two processes, reuse or building a new building? Also taking into consideration the overall square footage of a building. Obviously, from an operational point of view, a smaller building is going to use less energy, use less heating costs than a larger building. And with COVID and more people working from home and the need maybe for less office space, that's an important consideration. Also alternative building systems, prefabricated or modular components. Those are beneficial from a carbon point of view because they produce less waste. Traditional construction, there's going to be a lot of extra concrete and steel and building components that never get into the building because things change when you're building them. But with modular, everything's built in the factory, so you get exactly what you need. So yeah, those are the benefits, I think, and hopefully I've described what the whole building design concept is.
Yeah, absolutely, David. And to kind of recap, what you and Patrick are both driving towards, we are seeing lower carbon production methods emerging for concrete and steel and other low carbon sequestering materials, including mass timber, becoming more popular. And we're starting to see that kind of exponentially ramp up. And David, I'd love to hear in your mind kind of what changed there, what key developments kind of really loosened the reins, so to speak, when integrating sustainability into construction on that mass scale, because it feels like, we've gained significant traction over the past several years, and sure, there's still some areas that need to be addressed there, but what kind of changed to drive that on the industry side?
Yeah, I think, Chris, that building professionals, have addressed the operational emissions for some time, right? I mean, energy efficient windows, more efficient insulation, other more efficient building materials, they've been around for a while. But I think the embodied carbon is really just starting to be addressed. I think cost is the main point of friction here. I mean, for operational carbon, it's pretty simple because the improvements in energy efficiency components pay for themselves through lower utility bills. So there's an incentive for building owners to build in operational improvements, such as efficient glazing, LED lighting, added insulation, building automation, things like that. For embodied carbon, though, it's likely going to cost more to build a low embodied carbon building right now than a conventional building. Although I will note, I did some research too before this, like Patrick. There was a recent report from the Rocky Mountain Institute, a case study that found that embodied carbon reductions of up to 46% could be achieved for less than 1% of the entire cost of the project. So that's an interesting caveat.
That's pretty impressive.
Yeah,
I wouldn't have guessed there was that big a difference.
Right. But, overall, you're probably going to see some extra costs. Now, I think part of that additional cost for addressing embodied carbon is more so in the time and effort it's going to take to do something you haven't done before. Generally, builders are looking at a number of big buckets when they're looking at building a building, right? Location, function, aesthetics, cost, and legal and code requirements. So all of a sudden, adding embodied carbon consideration, it's a whole other bucket of consideration, and there's going to be a learning curve to deal with that, and that's going to have an associated cost. But as I mentioned earlier, though, for a number of reasons, a number of pressure points, companies are looking to, especially public companies, are having to report on their emissions. So many of these will start looking not only at their operational carbon, but at the embodied carbon of the buildings that they're going to build or own or occupy. For privately held companies, though, and smaller companies, home builders, to begin addressing embodied carbon, it's probably going to take some time. And I think in order for that to happen, there's going to need to be a modification or changes to building codes, widespread availability of low carbon materials, and or either a price on carbon or tax credits for building with low carbon materials. So some of those things may need to happen until we really get widespread attention being paid to embodied carbon.
And Patrick, what about from an insurance perspective? Are there similar drivers and sticking points there? Legal side, governance, are you guys seeing something different, or is it pretty well aligned with the construction side of the business?
Yeah, I think it's well aligned. I know, David spoke to cost as a friction. Maybe another accretive thing I'd add, and something that obviously is front of mind with everyone. But when we think about builders and owners being able to deliver some of these sustainability commitments based on type of project or material, supply chain continues to be an issue. Going back to, what was it this past October, November, the amount of supply that we had stuck out in the West Coast trying to get to port, that had impact across the construction industry, across product type, material type, but specifically had some challenges in, in the alternative energy space. We haven't really spoken to that, but, we had a number of clients that had a significant amount of panels that would to be installed on large solar array projects that simply, have been delayed because of the inability to get it through the port system. So, that's an interesting aspect. That's a challenge. I also think about the volatility in price, which again has been in large part across many materials. But you think about lumber that we spoke about mass timber a moment ago. That volatility created certainly changes in the cost of the raw goods that go into the manufacturing of mass timber, and then of course mass timber, just the general amount or lack of amount rather of manufacturing to meet that growing demand. I think that'll continue to create some constraints and some challenges in order to meet some of those requests. And then I think about it from a risk perspective, and a lot of it goes back to climate change. Just changing weather patterns in general. I mentioned solar. Big solar arrays, from a risk perspective, are subject to what we consider secondary natural catastrophe perils, which think of things other than hurricanes, floods and earthquakes. These are things like rise in tornadoes, rise in frequency in hail events or straight line wind events. The newly minted term last year called the derecho, basically an inland hurricane through the Midwest. These changing weather patterns do create different sorts of risks, exposures, and considerations that do impact the sustainable construction space, in addition to the general construction space as well.
Yeah, even just taking a look at Dallas, right, got hit with that winter storm last year, and you never would have thought about snow and ice damage to a solar farm in Texas. That's a new occurring event. And I think of this. My dad works for a large general contractor, and so in my mind, growing up, construction was always the process of building something new, right? It's new construction. But, in thinking about that, really, and what David said was embodied carbon and the life cycle of that building. I wonder, David, 10 to 20 years from now, from a sustainability standpoint, do you think that the buildings that we're building are they going to be compatible with the goals of where we're trying to go here?
Yeah, that's a good question, Michael. I think one way that the building industry can be compatible with net zero goals really is to align with the developments in clean energy. The goal is for the electric grid to be carbon free by 2050, maybe sooner. And we've been seeing a lot of momentum there with the expansion of solar power. As the price of solar panels has dropped, we're seeing, a shrinkage of coal generation, and we're seeing a continued increase in wind, both onshore and offshore. So in order to take advantage of that clean electric grid, we need to electrify not just our vehicles, but also our buildings. Another pretty alarming statistic I ran into was that currently about 9% of all greenhouse gas emissions in the US comes from on-site fossil fuel combustion in buildings. So that's for heating, water heating, cooking, laundry, other industrial processes. So, right now there are viable electric systems that could be incorporated into buildings to substitute for all those needs. I mean, electric heat pumps have really made great strides over the last decade or so. They can now operate very efficiently in sub-freezing temperatures. And there's great electric stovetops, electric water heaters, clothes dryers. So it's really critical that new buildings incorporate these electric building systems so they're in a position to take advantage of the clean electric grid once it's widespread. And it also makes economic sense because we see what's happening right now with the fluctuations in natural gas prices, and that's only going to continue as the market for gas and heating oil shrinks in the future.
Yeah, excellent points, David. And Patrick, I know you had talked about mass timber and expanding the insurance coverages for that. Are there ways that you're seeing carriers addressing sustainability in the marketplace outside of just that?
Yeah, there are, and there are certain topics that become or that are becoming more and more of interest. And the first one that comes to mind is the rise in utilization of parametric insurance. So whether it's clients using parametric insurance to hedge volatility of weather or for other reasons, we think parametric has an opportunity to fill really an uninsurable void that's currently in the marketplace as we continue to see rising severe and frequent weather events across the country that we normally didn't deal with historically. And Zurich is actually taking a product leadership position and recently launched a construction weather parametric product. And if you're not familiar with parametric, I'll back up quickly for a second. The basics around a parametric, different from a traditional property policy, is that a parametric policy does not require the existence of physical damage from a covered cause of loss to provide any sort of indemnity. A parametric policy is actually an objective measure or a parameter that's built around some sort of trigger. So Zurich's specific triggers serving the construction space is to acknowledge that really weather patterns not only are A, changing, but B, can really affect any type of construction project. All construction projects are constructed outside in the elements. So, some construction projects are more exposed or less exposed, but they're all exposed at some aspect of the phase of the project. And so that's why we were really excited to deliver a parametric solution that focuses on those costs that are incurred on a project, regardless of whether that the contractor or owner is able to work that day. And that's what the indemnity provides is for those delays as a result of things like rain or wind or extreme heat or cold, potentially snow in the future. And solutions like that, I think, are what the market and clients will be demanding. Unique, non-traditional solutions that fill the changing exposures based on the volatility of climate change that otherwise wouldn't be covered by traditional insurance. So we were very excited to really deliver a novel construction solution, a parametric solution, and the client response has been very interested and excited to see how it can apply to different aspects of projects.
And that's very interesting, Patrick, in an industry that I think has been tagged as kind of slow to adopt change and technology. I think that's rapidly changing, and one of the focal points of our podcast too. But how are builders and owners and insurance carriers embracing some of this new and emerging trends and eco-friendly options and in construction in that industry that is slow to adopt change, or has at least been characterized that way? Like I said, I think that's changing, but are we seeing that too on the green side of the business?
As a loyalist of the insurance market, I of course will not take offense to that. I think there's a lot of truth in that feedback. I think the joke is, the insurance market isn't known for its innovative qualities, right? And so these parametric type solutions, are an example of that innovation and thought leadership that we must speak to and continue to deliver to the market, as things change. But to your point, really the challenge is the lack of data and lack of history in some of these new and emerging risks. So again, back to my earlier comment about as successful project completions come to the market, I think that'll continue to have a positive impact and trend that general level of comfort. And, take mass timber, for example. I know that we've spoken quite a bit about that and for good reason. But, the important things about mass timber really, in our research and in our relationships and, many fabricators or manufacturers or actually builders, is really delineating that fact and not trying to position it similar to, a traditional non-combustible or other fire resistive type material, but really decoupling it from light wood frame and highlighting the differences from a combustibility perspective relative to light wood frame. I think that's the important piece. So I think that goes to, to the overall point of education, communication. There are a lot of incredibly intelligent and forward-thinking individuals in a lot of these eco-friendly and sustainability space. So translating some of the raw information, the data and the facts, to the insurance carriers, of course, is ideal and will hopefully make it more palatable as these emerging risks continue to come to market. So really, it's all around the conversation and providing the information, which we all try to do our best at.
Guys, I got to thank you for coming on the show. It's been so illuminating to speak to both of you about this. It is an emerging trend and topic, and I think one that we're going to see for a long time. As you may have known with some of the research you did, our show, we do like to give our audience an action item, keeping in mind that our audience is primarily comprised of contractors, insurers, brokers, people in the construction insurance industry. If you're a member of the audience and you're listening today, what's one thing that you would recommend that they be able to implement tomorrow, starting to move in that positive trend? I guess, Patrick, I'll start with you if I could.
Yeah, I mean, these are difficult questions to answer and a bit anecdotal, but from my perspective as the insurance carrier, oftentimes, I may be middle to end of process. And so integration of all project stakeholders, whether it's from the, the construction value chain, from the owner to the designers, to the prime contractors, to the subcontractors, to the insurance carriers, to the brokers, to the ultimate buyers, et cetera, really integration of that project stakeholder value chain is really critical, and I think will be incredibly important in engagement and successful engagement on a lot of these new and unique projects. And engaging services from an insurance perspective with carriers that have engineering services and that know-how and ability to truly understand and digest the information and translate that to actionable items, which really starts with that communication, I think is really the most important piece, and that I would implore the listeners to think about and maybe take away from this conversation, as a lot of these topics are very emerging and very, very new. So from my standpoint, the communication piece is critical.
And David, how about you? If there's one action item there, what would your one thing be if you could give a piece of advice to our audience?
Yeah, I would again stress electrification of building systems. Let's get the buildings that we're building now ready to take advantage of the clean electric grid of the future. And, in the interim, for areas of the country where, the electric supply may still be dependent on fossil fuels, a great option is renewable energy power purchase agreements. So, yeah, I would again say electrification of building systems.
Awesome. And David, I'm gonna keep on here for a second, because we also like to give 3 takeaways. We have our action items, but again, if I'm listening to this and this awesome discussion we're having today, what are the 3 big takeaways from the environmental perspective you think that our listeners should be looking out for?
Yeah, sure, Michael. I tell you what, I'll take the first 2 and I'll leave the third for Patrick.
Okay.
So first, I think the construction industry has got a great opportunity to be a really significant positive agent of change in the fight against climate change. I mean, with 40% of the emissions coming from the built environment, there's really no way that we're going to reach net zero and avoid a climate disaster without the construction industry's help. So it's a big responsibility, but I think they're up to the task. Secondly, and I think Patrick alluded to this earlier, but the next 10, 20, 30 years, we are going to see the pace of change really increase. The climate, weather patterns, sea level rise, the laws and regulations in response to those things, consumer preferences are all going to be changing at a very rapid pace as the climate warms and as these net zero transitions pick up. So the construction industry, really needs to stay ahead of the curve, because the buildings that they're building are going to be around with us for decades. And those buildings are either going to be part of the solution to climate change, or they're going to be part of the problem. So with that, I'll pass it off to Patrick for the last one.
Yeah, sure, David. I think those are wonderful points, and I'd really emphasize that all of the economy is going to really need to work together to transition to meet the needs, the goals, and objectives for a net zero future. So everyone in the construction industry needs to work together to advance sustainability. It's the developers, owners, architects, engineers, contractors, but also local, state, and federal governments. I think can play an important part in this and in driving the need for change. And we really see this and look to it as a challenge. It's an opportunity for the industry, and really that's how we try to approach it at Zurich. And I think that's what I would emphasize for the third point.
Excellent takeaways. So now to the fun part. This is the Building Bite. That stands for BIM Insurance Technology with the experts. You are today's experts. So we do like to ask our guests, what are you taking a bite out of today? What's the number one food place? Is it your own kitchen? Is it a local place? Tell us. Start with Patrick. I'll keep with Patrick at this point.
This is a bit of a loaded question because I'm a practicing and failing executive chef, and a lot of people picked up different hobbies during COVID, and one of mine was becoming a better chef. So I'll say that I'm a good chef. If you ask the McBride household, they'll probably disagree. But I think what's on the docket tonight, we try to cook in with 2 small children as well, which is usually always sounds a lot better to go to dinner than how it actually turns out with a 3 and a 1-year-old. So we typically stay in. But I think tonight I'm on the docket for some chicken curry. So we love cooking any and all types of Asian foods in our household. So I think that's what's up for dinner tonight. So you're welcome to come over and have some and test it.
Patrick, it sounds like your kids are a lot more adventurous in the culinary space than mine are. If it's not chicken fingers. I was
going to say chicken fingers was good enough for me, but all right. Chicken curry, that's great. David, what about yourself?
Yeah, I by no means am the chef in my house, so I asked my wife what we were having in anticipation of this question. And she's actually making saag paneer, which is a Indian dish that she likes to experiment with, which it's kind of like a cheese and like a spinach puree kind of, and then you eat it with naan, which is the Indian bread, which she's going to make from scratch. So should be good.
All right. Well, Patrick and David, thank you guys for chatting with us today. We definitely really appreciate it. If our listeners want to hook up with you guys after the podcast, where can they find you?
Sure. Yeah. My email is patrick.mcbride@zurichna.com, or you can find me on LinkedIn, of course, under my name, Patrick McBride.
And I'm David.Edsey, EDSEY @zurichna.com. And you can find me on LinkedIn as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys. Very informative. And one of the more, I think, educational podcasts that Mike and I have had the opportunity to do. So we definitely appreciate your time. Thank you guys for joining us and look forward to chatting with you again soon.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Michael.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you for listening to The Building Bite. This podcast has been brought to you by Proactive. Check us out on thebuildingbite.com, where you can subscribe to our newsletter and follow us on social media for all future The Building Bite news and updates. You can also find us on your favorite apps, including Apple and Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, TuneIn, and Amazon. If you have ideas for episode topics that we should cover on the show, or you know somebody who would be a perfect guest, let us know at connect@thebuildingbite.com.